The book is called A Question of Torture, CIA Interrogation from the Cold War to the War on Terror. And we're joined by its author, Alfred McCoy, professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We welcome you to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy.
Give us a history lesson.
Well, if you look at that most famous of photographs from Abu Ghraib of the Iraqi standing on the box, arms extended, with a hood over his head and the fake electrical wires from his arms, okay? In that photograph, you can see the entire 50-year history of CIA torture. It's very simple. He's hooded for sensory disorientation, and his arms are extended for self-inflicted pain. And those are the two very simple, fundamental CIA techniques developed at enormous cost. Very simple behavioral findings outsourced to our leading universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, McGill. And the first breakthrough came at McGill. All they did was had student volunteers sit in a cubicle with goggles, gloves, and headphones, earmuffs, so that they were cut off from their senses. And within 48 hours, denied sensory stimulation, they would suffer first hallucinations, then ultimately breakdown. And if you look at many of those photographs, what do they show? They show people with bags over their head. Now, then the second major breakthrough that the CIA had came here in New York City at Cornell University Medical Center, and they found that the most effective KGB technique was self-inflicted pain. You simply make somebody stand for a day or two. As they stand, what happens is the fluids flow down to the legs swell, lesions form, they erupt, they suppurate, hallucinations start, the kidneys shut down. Several of those photos you just showed, one of them with a man with a bag on his arm, his arms are straight in front of him. People are standing with their arms extended. That's self-inflicted pain. And the combination of those two techniques, sensory disorientation and self-inflicted pain, is the basis of the CIA's technique. One of the things that Donald Rumsfeld did right at the start of the War of Terror, in late 2002, he appointed General Jeffrey Miller to be chief at Guantanamo, all right, because the previous commanders of Guantanamo were too soft in the detainees. And General Miller turned Guantanamo into a de facto behavioral research laboratory, a kind of torture research laboratory. And under General Miller at Guantanamo, they perfected the CIA torture paradigm. They added to it an attack on cultural sensitivity, particularly Arab male sensitivity to issues of gender and sexual identity. And then they went further still. Under General Miller, they created these things called biscuit teams, behavioral science consultation teams. And they actually had qualified military psychologists participating in the ongoing interrogation. And these psychologists would identify individual phobias like fear of dark or attachment to mother. And by the time we're done, by 2003, under General Miller, Guantanamo had perfected the CIA paradigm, and it had a threefold total assault on the human psyche: sensory receptors, self-inflicted pain, cultural sensitivity, and individual fears and phobia.
And then they sent General Miller to, quote, Gitmoize Abu Ghraib.
In late August 2003, General Miller was sent from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib, and he brought his techniques with him. He brought a CD, and he brought a manual of his techniques. He gave them to the MP officers, the military intelligence officers, and to General Ricardo Sanchez, U.S. commander in Iraq. In September of 2003, General Sanchez issued orders, detailed orders for expanded interrogation techniques beyond those allowed in the U.S. Army Field Manual 3452. There's a striking continuity across this 40-year span in both the general principles, this total assault on the existential platforms of human identity and existence, okay? There is no such thing as a little bit of torture. The whole myth of scientific surgical torture that torture advocates, academic advocates in this country came up with, it's impossible. They cannot operate. It will inevitably spread. At the time, William Safire, for example, writing in the New York Times, said this was the work of creeps. Later on, ex-Defense Secretary Schlesinger said this was just abuse by a few people on the night shift. There was another phrase, recycled hillbillies from Cumberland, Maryland. In other words, this was the bad apple thesis. We could blame these bad apples. I looked at those photos. I didn't see individual abuse. What I saw was two textbook, trademark CIA psychological interrogation techniques, okay? Self-inflicted pain and sensory disorientation. The UN Convention, which bans torture in 1984, gives equal weight to psychological and physical techniques. Okay? We alone as a society somehow exempt all these psychological techniques. That dates back, of course, to the way that we ratified the convention in the first place. When President Clinton sent the UN Anti-Torture Convention to the U.S. Congress for ratification in 1994, he included 4 detailed paragraphs of reservation that had in fact been drafted by the Reagan administration, and he adopted them without so much as changing a semicolon. Those paragraphs of reservation are carefully written to avoid one word in the 26 printed pages of the UN Convention. That word is mental. Basically, we exempted psychological torture. Although, let's say, the civil authorities were sort of skirting the law by exempting psychological techniques, the U.S. Army rewrote their field manual with the intention of strictly observing the letter and the spirit of the UN Anti-Torture Convention and other similar treaties. So what happened is when the Defense Department gave orders for extreme techniques, when General Sanchez gave orders for his techniques beyond the Army field manual, what that meant is when the soldiers were actually investigated, they had committed crimes under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They would be prosecuted, and they were all being sent to jail.
Professor McCoy, you wrote a piece, Why the McCain Torture Ban Won't Work, the Bush Legacy of Legalized Torture.
Right. Most Americans think that it's over. Bush administration fought that amendment tooth and nail. Basically what happened is through the process, they introduced loopholes. Look, at the start of the war on terror, the Bush administration ordered torture. President Bush said right on September 11, 2001, when he addressed the nation, "I don't care what the international lawyers say, we're going to kick some ass." Those were his words. And then it was up to his legal advisors in the White House and the Justice Department to translate his otherwise unlawful orders into legal directives. And they did it by crafting 3 very controversial legal principles. One, that the president as commander-in-chief could override laws and treaties. 2, that there was a possible defense for CIA interrogators who engage in torture. And the defenses were of 2 kinds. First of all, they played around with the word severe. The torture is the infliction of severe pain. That's when J. Bybee, who was an assistant attorney general, wrote that memo in which he said severe means equivalent to organ failure. In other words, right up to the point of death. The other thing was that they came up with the idea of intentionality. If a CIA interrogator tortured, but the aim was information, not pain, then he could say that he was not guilty. The third principle, which was crafted by John Yoo, was Guantanamo is not part of the United States. It is exempt from the writ of U.S. courts. Now, in the process of ratifying passing the McCain torture, the torture prohibition, the McCain's ban on inhumane treatment, the White House has cleverly twisted the legislation to reestablish these 3 key principles. In his signing statement on December 30th, President Bush said...
This was a statement that he signed as he signed the McCain
ban
on torture.
Right. He emailed it at 8 o'clock at night from his ranch in Crawford on December 30th that he was signing this legislation into law. He said, I reserve the right as commander-in-chief and as head of the unitary executive to do what I need to do to defend America. Okay, that was the first thing. The next thing that happened is that McCain, as a compromise, inserted into the legislation a provision that if a CIA operative engages in inhumane treatment or torture, but believes that he or she was following a lawful order, then that's a defense. So they got the second principle, defense for CIA torturers. The third principle is that the White House had Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina amend McCain's amendment by inserting language into it saying that for the purposes of this act, the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo Bay is not on U.S. territory. And then, in the last month, the Bush administration has gone to federal courts and said, drop all your habeas corpus suits from Guantanamo. There are 160 of them. They've gone to the Supreme Court and said, drop your Guantanamo case. They, in fact, used that law to quash legal oversight of their actions.